Chapter 11, 26th day of April, 1679, evening. What a sight we were that evening! I, a midwife, stood with my husband, a merchant, and Willoughby, an ex-convict, outside the grand Paris house at the northwest corner of Lincoln's Inn Fields and Great Queen Street. The magnificent mansion was prominent in London's largest square, only rivalled by Lord Lindsay's splendid home further around the common. Never having visited the residence before, Pierre was suitably impressed, and Willoughby was so affected by the size of it that he took time to count the windows. 26, including the two on street level, he said, rubbing his hands together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 floors. Odds fish, in truth this is a palace. Noting his improved demeanour and ignoring his expletive, one that I had heard the king himself use, I turned to look at the building, a thing I had not done since I first visited it. The imposing front did indeed seem fit for royalty rather than an earl, but I was witness that, besides their seat in Wales, Lord and Lady Paris had possessed this townhouse for 7 years and were quite comfortable here. To both the left and to the right of the ornate iron gate and railings was set an arched entrance into a stone passage, each leading to an inside side door for trade callers and servants. We stood outside the closed gates, considering if we should use the dignified front entrance at the top of the broad stone steps normally reserved for callers of their own class, or whether, as I was wont to do when I came on matters of philanthropy, we used one of the two arched passageways. We should call at the front entrance, as in fitting for dinner guests, I decided. The three of us approached the immense fine-carved door that 5 persons might walk through side by side without touching shoulders, and Pierre took the wooden handle and tugged hard until it came from the wall. 3 times he pulled, and 3 times the bell beyond the door rang. Seeing Willoughby waiting tall and clean and handsome beside us on the steps brought forth images of that afternoon's tumbling one after the other through my head. Bargaining for Willoughby's release surprised me as having been the more effortless part of the day. The lewd comments of the turnkeys gave credence to how well I acted the part of the doxy, made easy by how little was already commonly thought of a midwife and her life. So long as they received a slice of the fees that went to the king, they cared little for any other thing. As I expected, thinking I wanted the man as a plaything, they demanded over the payment of his debt, but, as I hoped, did not consider him important enough to charge double or even triple. Once we reached the street and both breathed deeply of the spring air that smelled sweet after the cells, I found even I could not bear the smell he carried with him. I determined that, if I was somewhat used to the stench inside the prison, out here it was too overbearing. The delicate nose of Lady Paris would be affronted by such abhorrence. It was fortunate that I had earlier begged of Pierre his permission to take Willoughby home and clean him thoroughly before this night. It was further fortunate I had the good sense to dismiss the household staff that afternoon to prevent the wagging tongues of the tattletales and twattlers among them. They might talk too freely of this man's presence here, and ask questions too complicated to answer simply. With luck, none of the boys from St. Omer would be returned home, and we might make free with the house. Soon my arms ached from carrying pots of boiling water enough to fill 2 bathtubs, then from emptying the water away again. The first full tub, and a good deal of soap, took the most dirt from Willoughby and his underclothing. I could not help but be satisfied by the many crawling creatures swimming in the greasy scum on top of the foul water I tipped into the gutter. At the least there would be less lice to comb out after. Into the second tub I splashed some of my expensive oil of lavender from Paris to cloak the stubborn prison smell. I thought of the captain undressing. Without shame, and with his back to me, the captain had unbuttoned a still grey shirt and removed it so that he stood in the tub wearing only baggy breeches tied at the skinny middle and that clung to every scraggy part of him. As he dropped the soggy shirt to the floor, I gasped at his back, covered from neck to waist with ribbon scars that could only be made by the bite of lashes. Some wounds were yet unhealed. Turning his head at my noise and seeing how I looked at him, he turned his full body so I could not see more, and said, "You are shocked, madam. Does your husband not take penance from his flesh? I have found it the singular and most satisfying means of atoning for my sins." I shook my head. I had seen skin stripped from flesh by the tails before, but this man's back was more discoloured skin than that of sun-browned youth. I swallowed hard and tried to regain a more dispassionate disposition. "Does not confession to a priest absolve your sin?" I said. "The extent of my wrongs cannot be undone by confession alone." Once the bath was empty and Willoughby had on fresh dry underclothes and Pierre's nightgown, I had him sit while I worked on his hair. Some goose grease aided me in untangling some of the matted knots, but even after much heavy combing his hair still moved in a way it should not, so I resolved it must be short in order to use my fine-toothed comb and remove what insects held fast. Finally, what was left of his hair no longer had a life of its own, and some more lavender oil removed any last smell of confinement. To distract us while we worked on his ablutions, Willoughby told me how he had come to have torn ears, having had nails hammered through them into the pillory for counterfeiting. I resolved the periwig he should have must hide such shame. I then told Willoughby of my meeting with Percival Willoughby, a man midwife of Derbyshire. Despite interfering a little much in the business of a trade meant for women, he struck me as having more wisdom than I normally gave a man credit for. He would be about 80 now, and probably long in the ground, but I had met this worthy man when he had practised in London in the late 50s. We had both been called to deliver a lady of standing. My mind cloaks the identity of her. I had been impressed by his uncommon sense in waiting till the baby was ready to come, unlike some midwives who would as soon wrench it from the womb, rip open a mother's body than wait for Dame Nature. He did not hold with many traditional midwife customs that I had been taught by my mother, but the reasons he gave were sensible, and his influence on me had since saved, I believe, many babies and their mothers. The man had still held my greatest respect, and I would have been honoured to know him, Willoughby, as a relative of him, but the answer was still no. He did not know any such man, though he may be distant by blood, he imagined. A knock on the door admitted Margaret, back from completing a task for me. "Do you have them?" Instead of answering, Margaret took in the half-dressed, hairless young man behind me, and nodded curtly. It was unlike her to be silent. Like Susan, he usually had much to say on any matters, whether desired or not. I held out my hand for the clothes she held in hers. Finally she answered, "Yes, madam, but they are overmuch large." This, I presumed, was after a fast assessment of how little flesh was left on Willoughby's bones. "They will have to do. A few good meals is what he needs." "My coat, where did you find it?" "In the pawn shop where you left it," I answered him. I showed him our bedchamber, and then Margaret and I left him to dress. A short while after, a young gentleman emerged from my room. Margaret and I stopped to appraise him. His clothes were obviously fitted in better days when his body had some flesh. There was no single place he now filled them as they should be filled, and they hung on him as if he was a stick. But still, the difference from when he arrived 2 hours since was as a tree in spring is to a tree in winter. In his finery he was a gentleman once more. "Close your mouth, Margaret," I told my maid the moment I remembered to close my own. You will do, Captain. Are you hungry? We were to meet Pierre and Lady Paris. We were to meet Pierre at Lady Paris's house in half an hour, and we appeared to be ready. I most certainly am, my lady. It is a delight to be my own self once more, he said, eyeing his reflection in the looking-glass above the fireplace. Mrs. Cellier, I answered absently, watching as he turned from one way and then the other, pleased with what he saw. Indeed, his graceful movement was a delight on the eyes. By happy chance, the arrival of our coach at Paris House had coincided with Pierre's, and after introducing Pierre and Willoughby, we proceeded to the door where we now waited. I had allowed Margaret the rest of the day for her own entertainment, once she had taken care of one last message to Lord Castlemaine, asking him if we might meet to discuss the best way to place my petition about the prisons in front of the government. Eventually an old bowed man, who I owned must regularly walk beside the reaper, opened the door and showed us the parlour, where the Countess of Paris stood to greet us. Mrs. Cellier, it gives me rare pleasure to reacquaint with you. The pleasure is wholly mine, Lady Paris. If it so please you, may I introduce Monsieur Pierre Cellier, my husband? Pierre took Lady Paris's proffered hand and bowed charmingly over it. Bonsoir, my lady, he said. I could not be more delighted to make the acquaintance of both beauty and Samaritan in one fell swoop. And this must be our friend from Newgate. Miss Lady Paris was too impatient for me to introduce him properly. Indeed, my lady, this is Captain Thomas Willoughby. Captain Willoughby, Lady Paris. Enchanted, to be sure, said Willoughby, echoing how Pierre took Lady Paris's hand and leaned over it. But he bowed so low and with such an embellished flourish of his hands, even I, who had seen him there, could not imagine that this afternoon he had graced Newgate with his presence and was in such a sorry state. His shakiness did nothing to reduce his charm. Then he raised her small, white-gloved fingers back to his full standing height and kissed them elaborately. Lady Paris should have grabbed her hand back at his audaciousness, but it was obvious his flamboyancy and charm, as it did me, captured her straight away. It will be my eternal happiness to repay the kindness you have shown me, he said, echoing the words he had told me over and again. After the requisite pleasantries, Lady Paris said, Shall we adjourn to the dining-room? Dinner is, I believe, ready to be served, and proffered her arm for Willoughby to take in his. Pierre, in turn, took my arm, and we followed a few steps behind our hostess. We ate a sumptuous meal of soup served with bread rolls, followed by diverse meats such as pheasant, pork and lamb from the countryside, and the season's first asparagus served in verjuice dressing, made from the last season's crab apples, as well as some pickled vegetables and sauces. Each course was served in the finest ornate silver dishes, the likes of which we were not so advantaged to have in our own home. The closing course was a jam-rolled sponge covered with sweet fruit sauce bottled last autumn. Between courses, Lady Paris was so good as to show off her two pretty servant girls, dark as any I saw in Newgate, and as colourfully dressed in their finery as any I had seen in the palace. The father of this exotic pair, she informed us, came to England on a merchant ship from Guinea, and now worked as the Paris's head groom. When we had finished admiring them, they left to fetch the next dishes. Though I warned him against it, I expected Willoughby to betray his previous dwelling by engorging himself in the manner of an animal, as he had so ravaged the bread I had brought to the prison. But he conducted himself with the civility of a gentleman. In fact, he ate delicately and surprised me by declaring himself full long before the rest of us. My husband, seeing how perplexed I was, and with more knowledge of such things than I, spoke. It is commonly said that a man's stomach will shrink when he does not partake of victuals for a long while. His harsh tone surprised me, considering where poor Willoughby was recently held, and his look towards Willoughby was equal in severity. The topic of prisons had not been opened, but now it was no longer to be avoided. On being asked, I told a little about some prisoners in Newgate, among them that most delightful man, Charles Baker, that was accused of being a priest in Wales. I had met on several occasions in the time he had lived there. They call him by his birth name, David Lewis, and the turnkeys tell me he is to be further examined with regard to the Popish plot, I said. What right they have to condemn an old man like him for his goodness, I do not know, for even in jail he already has a reputation of being the kindest man. With my own eyes I have seen him give another his last bite of bread, and also his only blanket to a sick man that could not stand for or sit. Familiar anger, when I thought of his treatment, took my appetite. For a while we quietly discussed this deed. Then Lady Paris delicately probed Captain Willoughby. What terrible sights must a man see in that place? Indeed, my lady, he gave nothing of them away, and it is my honour to be in the company of the good Samaritan who rescued me from such sights, and to whom I must offer a most fervent hope of repaying their goodness. The sincerity in his eyes warmed every person at the table, but how oft he repeated the words began to be tiresome, though I was pleased to be determined to do so. Tell us about this Strode character you have acquainted yourself with. Did he speak to you more of a plot? Pierre and I looked at each other at this indiscretion. She had not even checked if any servant were nearby. Mere mention of a plot by her might give authorities cause to charge her with conspiracy, and worse, her loose talk could put us all at risk. Any servant might be pleased to turn her in for a few coins. He did not, my lady, though it was not for want of trying. Neither spirit nor ale nor opium released his clam-mouthed hinges. For a moment Willoughby leaned both elbows on the table, as if weariness might better him. It was apparent he would sleep long and deep once he was allowed the luxury of a warm, clean bed. But for the price of freedom, he has vowed to come around and to no longer perjure himself. He has also vowed to give up to us proof of the perjury by Oates' man, Bedloe, a letter to him from Bedloe that he keeps at his house. And this letter will prove the Catholics' plot false? Asked Lady Paris, her eyebrows raised. Willoughby leaned further across the table, his face momentarily lit by inner zeal. The proof within it is that Bedloe was paid by Oates to speak false and will disarm him. That is for the exoneration of all that are wrongly accused, said Lady Paris. She would, of course, be thinking of her husband and the other 4 lords who every person knew had been in the Tower many months in fear of their lives. Indeed, my lady, it would be advantageous to have such proofs of the double plot, but we will have none unless we have the letter. In it, Bedloe admits to knowing nothing of the plot but what Oates told him, and shows he is therefore a false witness. All that he has said in court to the cause of death of Coleman and Ireland and the ones erroneously hanged for murdering Sir Edmund Berry Godfrey and others since, all of this was fabricated by Oates. We must give aid to him then, she said. Such proofs may save the lives of so many others. My wife interjected here. Nay, my lady, you must not say what I believe you say. The king has proclaimed that any who discover the Catholic plot against him should be rewarded. I merely propose any who can provide proof that such a dastardly plan against the Catholics should be rewarded handsomely. Is that not fair? Her jaw firmed as she clenched her teeth stubbornly together. I had underestimated the lady's inner strength. Pierre studied Lady Paris for some time, also knowing the truth of her words. She would pay well for such proof, but I suspected she would not care where the proof came from, or even if it were honest, so long as it would release her husband. Pierre saw this too, but did not follow with further questions or reproofs. Perhaps he also realised Lady Paris's desperation. "Just as long as it comes from a good source, my lady," he said, settling on a reminder to play close to the truth. "I am sure Captain Willoughby would mark his sources well. Is that not so, Captain?" Willoughby had followed the conversation closely and knew well what Lady Paris asked. He did not hesitate even for a moment to answer. "My lady, for you I will find witnesses against the sham plot, though I have to search every corner of the land." "Start at the house of Shaftesbury," I said, once I had finished my gulp of wine. "If he is the ringleader, as you say, he will be a fruitful source, of that I am certain." "Indeed, madam." As Willoughby turned his whole attention to me, my heart pounded in my chest, and though I was long past the first flush of youth, heat flamed my face just as if I were not. I hoped it would be put down to that I was passing into the other side of childbearing years, or the wine and the warmth. He continued, "I will begin there, and then examine the business of every one of his cronies until I discover all of their wicked plans. Mark me, I am a man of my word." He was so ardent, I believed he would too. A bell rang twice somewhere in the large house. As if by consent, we fell to silence and listened to hear who called at this time. Not much was revealed by the sound through the door, but shortly after, Margaret, still wearing her cloak, was admitted to the dining room. She brought with her a draught from the cool evening outside, and also a written reply from Lord Castlemaine. As ever, she revealed little but calm. If ever she knew the content of the notes she carried, she kept them close to herself and acted as if she did not. Without a word, she simply handed the paper to me with a bob and kept her eyes lowered, as she would in polite company. It was not sealed, merely folded, and I begged pardon while I read the brief message to say he would meet with me on the morrow before noon, and that I need not reply, but arrive at his house at a time that suited me, for he would be at home the whole day. "I thank you, Margaret. You may take your leave now." I dismissed my maid, and she left. "Another message before I go, ma'am." Margaret leaned her face close to my ear. I barely heard her words. "The coachman, France, has sent you a gift of a weanling colt for your trouble. He calls it Thor, and it awaits you in the stable at Arundel House." Then she was gone. As the door closed on Margaret, I folded the note and unobtrusively tucked it into my dress pocket for safekeeping. How kind of Prance to thank me for my services to himself and his wife with a young horse. But perhaps I should not accept such gratitude, for it could bond us together in a way that might have tongues wagging, for any person might recognise it as one from his stable. "That was my cousin's writing, I will warrant," said Lady Paris. "Lord Castlemaine," I nodded agreement. "I told her I would meet him the following day, and she asked me to convey her regards to him." This settled, Lady Paris asked after several of the Catholic gentry with child she had interest in, and that I had recently visited. When we finished the meal, we adjourned to the drawing-room for coffee, a drink more properly to be found in the coffee-houses these days, and not often drunk past afternoon, lest one must keep company with the stars. We passed that time pleasantly, and no more was said on plots or sham plots. As we were taking our leave, Willoughby revealed he had no place to sleep. Demonstrating she was not herself unmoved by the handsome young man in our midst, and perhaps it was the association of Willoughby and bed, a somewhat decomposed Lady Paris proclaimed, "Caution demands that you cannot stay here, else you would be most welcome. But conscience will not allow your release from one hell only to be set in the middle of another. We must secure a room for you for your stay. What could only be considered a mischievous gleam came into Willoughby's eyes, a gleam that revealed he not only had knowledge of his potency, but also of his ability to influence circumstance in his favour. Indeed, I near expected Lady Paris to insist upon good breeding that he should stay with her, since it was obvious she had more than enough rooms for the purpose, but Pierre's intervention prevented her from committing an indiscretion she would later regret. There is an inn under the sign of the Goat in Drury Lane that might have a room. I will make inquiries if they have a bed for the night. By good chance they did, and after giving Willoughby 10 shillings, Lady Paris had generously bestowed upon him as a weekly allowance. Pierre and I continued by coach towards home, and as we went we talked. You must be careful, my love. Lady Paris is a desperate woman, and she would have Willoughby wrong truth for her own ends. The truth is, I said, we Catholics are falsely blamed for deeds we have not committed, plots we have not hatched. Is it so wrong to seek the truth of it all? Nay, chérie, not if it is the truth that is sought and found. But I do not trust Willoughby to find only the truth, he said, echoing my earlier thoughts. You must discover if he is trustworthy. Pray, how should I do that? Find how the stars were aligned when he was born. Pierre crooked his arm around my shoulder and drew me towards him as the coach swayed to the sound of turning wheels. You mean Gadbury? Perhaps our astrologer can tell you which way his personality lies. Do you think it necessary? Can you not learn to trust him from past actions? There is something too charming, too fluid about the man. He seems to flow into this role from another all too easily. I wonder if he would fill any mould as long as it were lucrative enough. I felt myself bristle and defend him. I do not see that gives you cause to say so, but I vouched for him when I paid his debts. You are perhaps too trusting, Lizzie, but you must yourself know how spies are everywhere, especially where poverty daily holds hostages for ransom. Are you certain you should vouch for him when you know nothing of him? I will ask Gadbury. Distinction in his art gives me hope he can advise me wisely. And when you do, please remember me to him, Lizzie dearest. He had known Gadbury for more years than we had been married. Indeed, he had introduced me to the astrologer, but Pierre's confidence in the man's skills remained uncertain. I will tell him if it is one for whom you might employ to collect debts, I said, not wholly hearing Pierre. Have you another message for him? He laughed and said, not that he will already have not foreseen in the stars. And on that lighter note, I placed my head on his shoulders and enjoyed the remaining journey home in the security of his embrace.